If the thought of a shark sinking its teeth into you and eating you alive scares you, imagine getting attacked by two at once. That's exactly what happened to the diver in today's video, making it quite possibly the most terrifying shark attack story of all time. Hit that like button and subscribe right now. This is the tragic man-eating shark attack in Cane Bay. Welcome to Final Affliction. The following story not only showcases the power of human resilience and perseverance in the face of unfathomable tragedy, but also highlights the highly unpredictable nature of sharks and how far we are yet to come before we begin to understand their complex and mysterious behavior. On October 14, 1972, three men by the names of Bret Gillian, Rodney Temple, and Rodney McKelvin were on a scientific expedition to recover samples for a research project being conducted at Cane Bay on the island of St. Croix, North Shore. Gilliam described the area as having some of the best wall diving locations in the Eastern Caribbean. Even the drop-off was fairly easy, requiring no long boat trip. The team's goal was to collect some photographs and check on traps they had set up for a project. The only problem was their destination was situated on a 210-foot wall that was right next to a steep drop-off. The trio wasn't particularly worried though, not in the slightest, as they each were veterans of hundreds of deep dives. Rod served as a dive leader and timekeeper. He documented the dives and monitored ascent times to ensure everyone remained safe, while Bret and Robbie handled most of the heavy lifting. All three of them donned their gear and dove into the ocean, beginning what would soon become their ill-fated journey down the Cane Bay Wall. After reaching their destination, Bret and Robbie got to work while Rod scanned his surroundings. As he was looking around, Rod caught a glimpse of something truly terrifying. It was the sight of two white-tipped sharks off in the distance, one 12 feet long and the other marginally bigger. The oceanic white-tipped shark is a truly terrifying creature that mainly inhabits tropical and warm temperate seas. It is most notable for its long, white-tipped, rounded fins. According to recent studies, the species is becoming less common as a result of strong demand for its enormous fins, which constitute the main component of shark fin soup. It favors eating gastropods, crabs, birds, stingrays, sea turtles, and threadfin. However, this hunter will pretty much eat anything, humans included. Those slow-moving, oceanic white-tipped sharks are without question highly dangerous to humans. They are especially known to frequently attack survivors of ships and plane wrecks at sea, and are suspected to be responsible for several unrecorded human fatalities. To give you an idea of how vicious it is, the white-tip was the major species involved in what many people consider to be one of the worst mass shark attacks ever documented, ripping and mauling many of the USS Indianapolis' surviving crew after it was blown up back in 1945. It's estimated that the white-tip sharks are responsible for up to 150 deaths in that single incident alone. After finishing up their required observations, the three men noticed they were ahead of schedule and felt ecstatic, as this meant that they would only need about 20 minutes of decompression time, meaning they wouldn't have to linger for too long around the sharks. Bret later stated, "I remember thinking how strange it was to see oceanic white-tips right here on the wall at Cane Bay. It was kind of like walking off your back porch and seeing an African lion when you expected an alley cat." Robbie went up first and pointed out the sharks again as they swam by them. The crew were no strangers to these sharks, as they had their fair share of nasty encounters with white-tips when they worked offshore. The shark would frequently bite their equipment, the steel cables deployed from their research vessel, and even the shafts and propellers were targeted on occasion. These two sharks, however, looked to be unique in some way, as they didn't seem to pay any attention to them. As Bret turned around and began the ascent behind Robbie, Rod stayed behind as their carefully planned dive dictated he be the last to ascend. Bret met up with Robbie at about 175 feet just over the ledge, and they both rested on a coral while waiting for Rod to join them. However, they soon began to worry as he was growing late. Robbie looked at Bret and pointed to his pressure gauge, which showed he was beginning to run low on air. Suddenly, Robbie noticed a mass of bubble exhaust coming from the deeper water, which indicated Rod's presence down below. The two figured that Rod must have had some sort of air failure. Since Bret's air consumption was lower, he decided to send Robbie up while he went to check on Rod and see if he needed help. But when Bret reached Rod, things were about as bad as they could get. One of the sharks had bitten him on the left thigh without warning, and blood was gushing in red clouds from the wound. Bret was horrified and couldn't believe what he was seeing. Rod was desperately trying to beat the 12-foot animal off his leg and keep from sinking deeper. Bret lunged to his friend's aid, grabbing his right shoulder harness strap and pulling with all his strength. Almost simultaneously, the second shark hit Rod in the same leg and bit him savagely. Rod desperately gouged at the shark's eyes and gills as he grimly fought to beat off his attackers. In a desperate attempt to ward off his friend's attackers, Bret punched at the torsos of the hungry beasts as they tore great chunks of flesh from his friend's body. The two men continued their assault on the sharks as they seemed to squirm in pain, suddenly letting go of Rob and retreating back down to deeper waters. Desperate to reach safety, Bret looked up and caught a glimpse of Robbie, who was about 100 feet above and looking in horror. But in less than 15 seconds, the first shark returned and hit Rod again, dragging him and Bret both over the drop-off. The attack had probably only lasted a minute at this point, but Rod had lost a huge amount of blood and tissue and had gone almost completely limp as a result. Bret was clutching Rod's right harness strap as the second shark came back as well. This shark bit and hung on as the two plummeted down the side of the wall. Bret and Rod were dropping rapidly. His efforts to swim back up were fruitless as the sharks continued to bite and tear at Rod's helpless body, all the while dragging the two men deeper and deeper. Bret felt Rod move again to fend off another attack, and his hopes soared upon realizing that his friend was still alive. Bret clung briefly to the edge of the drop-off wall, putting a stop to their rapid descent, when suddenly both sharks retreated once again, and Bret watched them circle their position from about 10 feet away. Bret saw one shark swallow the remains of Rod's lower left leg right before his eyes. The other gulped a mouthful of flesh it had torn off. Rod, who was likely half conscious by now, looked up to his friend for the first time since the vicious assault began. He shook his head lightly and in pain, then tried to push Bret away, hoping to spare Bret's life and buy him some time to make his escape. Bret grabbed for Rod's waist harness as he felt his hands sink into his friend's now mutilated torso. Sadly, there was no harness left to reach for. Rod had been disemboweled. Bret took off for the surface with Rod clutched to his chest. Immediately, the sharks were on them again. Rod screamed for the last time as the second shark seized him by the midsection and shook him. The blue water turned turbid with bits of human tissues and blood. Bret was powerless as poor Rod was torn away from him. He watched in utter disbelief as Rod's lifeless body drifted into the abyss with the sharks fighting over him. The attack had started around 200 feet, and Bret's depth gauge was pegged at 325 feet, but he knew he was far deeper than that. Bret also almost completely depleted his oxygen supply. In a hopeless effort to make it out, Bret looked away from his friend's mangled body in what must have been his final goodbye before beginning his ascent towards the surface. His oxygen-starved brain was beginning to give out and the effects of hypoxia were beginning to show, but before he could reach the surface, Bret would drift into unconsciousness. Bret miraculously woke up on the surface, gasping for air. Apparently, the small volume of air in his safety vest he wore had been enough to float him the rest of the way up and save his life, but his survival was still a 1 in a million chance as he had to deal with an unknown amount of emitted decompression. Nonetheless, Bret began swimming to shore as fast as he could, but he felt his legs going numb. By the time he reached the beach, he could barely stand. A couple on their honeymoon chanced upon Bret's body as it drifted onto the beach. In an incredible burst of good fortune, it turned out the wife was an ER nurse who understood the pathology of decompression sickness. 2 days later, Bret was released from the hospital. He had astonishingly managed to survive ascending almost 400 feet without any decompression sequence, but not without permanent side effects. There was residual numbness in both of his arms and legs, along with substantial hearing loss and legal blindness in his right eye that will persist with him for the rest of his life. Robbie's last view of Rod and Bret were as the two were dragged over the wall in a cloud of blood by the sharks. He never saw Bret's ascent and so reported them both killed when he got to shore. It was not until Bret called his dad from the hospital that he knew that Bret had survived. A week later, Rob's memorial service was attended by his two friends at the beach. His body was never recovered. People are often too busy with their lives to take a step back and really think about the important things. We go through the motions day in and day out, not realizing that we may only have a limited amount of time left. Many people die without ever truly living, so it's best not to take life for granted, as just like Rod, you never truly know if tomorrow will be your last day on Earth, the day you finally come to terms with your final affliction.